Because I'm sharing my screen straight away, you can't see me at the moment, but I will be on camera once we get to chatting more at the end. It's helpful to have slides in a dry subject like metadata because it helps me illustrate things in a slightly better fashion. Thank you for inviting me to give you a talk about metadata and its importance. Obviously, I think it's important because all my working life has been involved with it, but hopefully I'll be able to help you see the ways in which it's useful to you. Metadata is simply data about data. And in library terms, it means data about the resources in your libraries. So I'm hoping to give you a wee tour of the highlights and, as Nora says, an overview of the changes and developments happening, and just talk a wee bit about my own role in BDS. I'm, as Nora says, very happy to take questions at the end, and hopefully we'll get a bit more of a just general discussion going. So, whatever the library and whomever the user, libraries are in the business of putting people together with the resources they need or want. And on many occasions, you simply enter the library and find what you're after, by browsing the shelves even. But if you need something specific, or you have to browse remotely, whether it's through lockdown or some other reason, then the catalogue becomes your obvious tool for selection. And we can start to see that finding something in the catalogue is entirely dependent on the metadata that has been added to the catalogue for each resource. It is also true that as soon as we start talking about library metadata, we immediately start talking about standards, and it's worth stating why. Standards are good for library catalogues because using a standard should mean that your metadata is fit for purpose. And by that I mean that it will do the job that it's supposed to do without you having to reinvent the wheel each time by figuring out what the important things are with respect to your resources. And it also means that your data can travel, whether that's from one system to another when you change your library management system, or whether it's from one organisation to another, whether it's through a cooperative agreement or because institutions develop and change and they have to merge catalogues. There are many reasons why, but pretty much all future selves are grateful to past selves for having good standard data. Standards also smooth out individual differences between the approaches of individuals doing the cataloguing across an institution and over time, although it is also a truism in cataloguing circles that you'll never come up with exactly the same answer twice despite our best efforts, because there's always some nuance that could be argued one way or another. However, standards give us the best chance of coming up with reliable and consistent data. There's quite the technobabble fog surrounding it all, and the standards comprise a whole bunch of acronyms. Basically, a bibliographic record is modern speak for a catalogue record. Traditional cataloguing creates bibliographic records, which comprise access points, which are the indexed headings in the bibliographic record, and descriptive metadata, which covers things like transcribed data from the resource and descriptions of the resource in terms of its content and format. There's also subject access to be accomplished through schemas such as GUI or Library of Congress subject headings. We can also have more in the modern catalogue record, such as a summary or extended table of contents data, and that tends at the moment to come via a trade standard known as ONIX. So in this little picture here, I've thrown some of the bigger acronyms in so that we start to see the kinds of things involved, and I'll talk about more about these as we go. So in the UK, the British Library is a useful benchmark for which are the important metadata standards to apply, and we have international bodies such as IFLA to look to as well. Standards help us to ensure that our metadata won't let us down, and the modern standards evolve over time. When the British Library first started to catalogue its resources, no record was taken of the language of the resource. It was felt to be self-evident. And now, many decades later, British Library staff are having to write clever computer programs to automatically assign the language of the resource to improve their older catalogue records. So I mentioned IFLA, their Statement of International Cataloguing Principles. I've put a wee summary up at the front there. Is a backbone of current descriptive cataloguing approaches. So we're devising metadata which represents the resource, is accurate, has sufficient and all the necessary data in to provide what the user needs, but is economic with the effort that goes into it. It's recognised that it costs money to create good metadata. So there is recognition taken that you can't necessarily include every possible thing. You have to do what is needed. And of course that varies from institution to institution. If you are a cataloguer in a special library, say a poetry library, then all of the poems in any given resource might be important data points. In a more general public library, you're not likely to be dealing with individual poems, just the volumes that contain the poems in terms of the specificity of your data. The other important IFLA standard is the library reference model, which is the consolidation of all the FRBR type models. So decades ago, the international body IFLA commissioned reports, functional requirements for bibliographic records, FRBR. So people talked about Ferberizing their catalogue. Basically, looked at ways in which our data could be modernized and thought of differently, and that's where we start to hear phrases such as whammy stacks and all sorts of what's the word? It pulls the wool over your eyes if you don't know what they're talking about. I'm quite happy to go into detail if anybody's interested, but basically works, expressions and manifestations, it's all modelling the bibliographic universe and how we represent our resources. So you obviously can have umpteen editions of classic works, but you could say that there was one work that was Jane Eyre, and then there would be many different versions of that, and you can start to see ways to make data more efficient if you model it in that way. So Ferber did that for books or bibliographic entities, and then there were further reports for functional requirements for authority data and functional requirements for subject authority data. Those have all been consolidated into one more consistent model, which is called the library reference model. It's the backbone of the Resource Description and Access Standard, RDA, which is our modern cataloguing standard. So if we go back a wee ways to the catalogue card, there's a long historical tradition of cataloguing, starting with the nobility and gentlemen employing scholars to create inventories of their book collections. The catalogue, in the form of a list of what is owned, gradually evolved to be a more useful tool that could be searched by author, title and subject. And that is most commonly recognised in the card catalogue with its index cards and drawers. And it should be borne in mind that the physical cards, with all their index terms, just the physicality of that was a significant factor in the rules that were devised for cataloguing back then. Brevity and reduction of repetition were important due to space constraints and administrative necessity. This is how we ended up with concepts such as main entry, the index point on the catalogue card with all of the available data, and then added entries, which are the index points for the additional cards, which would tell you where the main set of data was. I'm sure you can imagine the manual labour involved in maintaining such a paper-based system, as well as the work involved in adding to it. weeding stock, interlibrary loans, etc. would all have their impact on the management of that. And then MARC came along. That particular acronym basically just stands for Machine Readable Cataloguing. And it was basically just catalogue cards held in the computer. There was no real difference from the pieces of card, except that you had to learn the codes to input the data. And then once it was in the computer, the data could be searched much to get your answer more quickly and find what you were after. Our modern catalogues and MARC records sit within library management systems, and nowadays we more commonly talk about metadata rather than just catalogue cards and MARC records, because we need to encompass more than just the traditional library cataloguing tasks when we want to talk about the work involved in populating and managing a library's catalogue. We use Dublin Core to manage repositories. There are crowdsourcing tags for archival resources, and importing and manipulating large data sets from other institutions are all tasks which go beyond what would be understood as cataloguing, but fall within the remit of metadata management. Even within cataloguing, there are distinctions to be made, as I've mentioned in passing already, between descriptive metadata, authority control, and subject analysis. Our new bibliographic standards, such as RDA, are more interested in data which can plug into the semantic web, joining authors' names with not only all their books on the shelf, but also Wikipedia entries and images, etc. online. Linked data, and this screenshot is just a whole bunch of RDF triples, which is what linked data is made up of, is supported by data points having relationships established between them. And that's what RDA is aiming for. However, it's still most often used to create MARC records because that is what our current systems can handle. And MARC is so good at what it does, it's proving very difficult to move away from it. Some places are working with linked data and experimenting with that. And of course, what I'm showing you here is never meant to be looked at by a human. There are some graphic representations of the data points and the relationships between them, which give you something of an idea of the way in which one might be able to explore a set of data and find what you're interested in. However, we're at the moment much more focused on straightforward data creation and so on. And this feels like the right point to talk about what I actually do. So I work for BDS, and we are a company which, actually if I go to this slide first. So we're based in Scotland. I, even before COVID, worked remotely because I live in Argyll up on the west coast of Scotland, and BDS is based in Dumfries in the southwest of Scotland. I've been with the company since it was established in 1995, and our raison d'etre is to provide bibliographic records. The company has gradually got involved in doing other things, web services and film and music data, but the principal business is straightforward library resources, and in greatest part those are books, and even more so ebooks in the last wee while for understandable reasons. So I work for BDS, and what we do is create records to library standards for the library market. This slide hopefully illustrates some of the sort of method. In terms of the book division and what we do, we are receiving data on a daily basis from publishers. That's usually in the form of the publisher's data standard Onyx. It is a standard. We do, however, pretty much need a separate import program for every single publisher that sends us data, because they all do slightly different things with it. And we pull that into our system and map it to MARC fields, and then edit. We modify so that it fits with library standards, for instance, applying sentence case to titles. We use authority control by checking name headings against the name authority, the international name authority file, which is contributed to by the British Library and the Library of Congress. And we assign DUI, Library of Congress classification, Library of Congress subject headings, and use publisher information to provide summaries and so on. That data in the BDS database is then sent to our customers, quite often in a customized format, and MARC is generally what we're thinking in terms of, because we're doing the MARC coding and editing records on screen and dealing with customers who want MARC records. So we are fluent in the language of MARC, which is never going to be a terribly impressive party trick, but it works for us. Okay, so I've showed you that slide already, gives you a little bit of an idea. What's perhaps more impressive about BDS is the production efficiencies that we've managed to achieve through having our own in-house software for editing and managing our records, and, as I say, the use of the ONIX data that we get in from publishers is put to best effect. So our small team of cataloguers create over 4,000 CIP records per week, and over 700, well, that varies a bit more because it depends what gets requested, book in hand confirmed records per week, which add up to fairly impressive statistics across the year. And at the last count, the BDS database had over 4 million unique bibliographic records in it. So the ways in which we can talk about our data, as I said, is many and varied because of the differences between the different data elements. It's not necessarily as simple as saying a bibliographic record because of the different elements in it. Descriptive, authority data, subject related data, and so on. So I think now is the time where I want to stop using slides. So I will stop sharing my screen, which will hopefully bring my camera up. And we can have more in the way of questions, and then I can answer to the parts that you're most interested in.
I have a question.
Sure.
So with linked data,
yeah,
this is something that is not being used very much currently, or is it?
It is mostly being used at an experimental level by national libraries. So the National Library of Sweden, National Library of Spain are quite actively working with linked data, and I've seen plenty of presentations at conferences and so on with linked data. The idea being that librarians want to break down what they call the silos. Basically, the library catalogue is held in its own space, and it's not really accessible by the web. So people searching for a resource don't know that a library has it. So they want to expose their data to the web and have that found. Of course, it hugely depends on what your library's purpose is. If you're focused on a specific set of users, you really only need to do what they need you to do. You don't need to expose your data to the web. So I think that's one reason why it's national libraries that are interested, because they're trying to expose their national resource to everybody that's paid for them to do the work, i.e. all the taxpayers in the country. The Library of Congress are working on creating a new bibliographic carrier that they're calling BibFrame, which is supposed to be linked data. But the people who are actually working in the semantic web and linked data spheres already find it quite vexing because it doesn't use ontologies that already exist. They're sort of yet again coming up with more niche library specific things when there are existing technologies that it might make more sense to plug directly into. So what seems to be happening at the moment is that Mark is still live and kicking despite all the Mark is dead memes, etc. And what we're looking at doing, partly because it is so efficient and so good at what it does, but what's happening is that we're looking at more and more identifiers are going to start to be embedded into the Mark data. So instead of me having a name heading for Smith, John, born 19 Canteen, there will also be an ISNI identifier in there, so that either might be the whole URL for the ISNI identifier, or it might just be the ISNI code, but it can then be expanded out into a URL so that that would plug directly into the existing data set. And that immediately starts getting you linked into Wikipedia and Wikidata, because those identifiers are used in those places too. So I think that's the immediate way forward in terms of interest in linked data, is just to start incorporating identifiers in your Mark data.
Yeah, kind of following up on that. Sorry, I'll let Steve go first.
Fire away, Steve.
Hi, Jenny.
Right.
I was just interested in that sort of siloed nature of the library catalogue, because I work for the NHS.
Right.
And we wouldn't necessarily want people able to, outside of the organisation, to look at our catalogues necessarily.
Indeed.
Because they are very much intended for the clinicians and not necessarily for anyone else.
Yeah.
I do actually have a question as well.
Fire away. Fire away.
What are your thoughts on decolonisation and metadata?
Because
it's quite a big movement now within certainly HE libraries, is to look at the metadata that we've got within our catalogues and go, we can't say that, we can't have that as a term that people can search for.
Yeah.
But do we need to keep that for its historical value, or do we actually need to look at that in the light of, if you like, society now?
Oh, there's quite a lot of questions in there.
Yeah, okay. Sorry.
First off, I'm pleased to say that there are things happening in terms of addressing the archaic terms within our subject thesauri. So hopefully that ball will keep rolling and things will improve. When one is constrained by a standard, it does get quite frustrating when the standard doesn't move very quickly.
And none of them do.
Yeah. So one option for people wanting to use the standard but also serve their users appropriately is to use local headings to make up the shortfall and code them appropriately, of course. So you would use your second indicator in your Mark subject headings to say that this is a local term, or that you're pointing to a different thesauri than Library of Congress. Library of Congress kind of looks after the version control in terms of seeing their subject authority control means that you can see what all past terms were. So that sort of keeps a record of what was in that sense.
Okay. Yeah.
If you look at the Library of Congress Authority's website and look up a heading such as African American women, you will see all of the past terms that have been used. We regularly at BDS get queries from customers saying, why have you got the heading blacks? That seems a bit non-politically correct. and all we can do is point to the instruction given in the Library of Congress Subject Headings Manual and say, this is the heading we're instructed to use.
Yeah.
And there is a heading for whites as well, which you're advised to use in certain circumstances. So it's good to be able to point to a standard in the sense that this is why I'm doing this. I'm not necessarily, but it is also, as I say, good to know that the powers that be are moving things along so that you can. So another sort of sensitive issue, not necessarily on the sort of colonial front, but in terms of gender identity, there are many people who publish under different pseudonyms, and that's fine, but there are also people who change their name, sometimes for very significant reasons.
Yep.
And it's not great to be dead naming somebody in your catalogue. But it's difficult if you've got old resources with that name on, and then you've got new resources with a new name on, and you kind of want to make clear that they're all by the same person, but where does that leave you? So that there's quite a lot of things at work here. The RDA standard, Resource Description and Access, used to have as part of their instructions for creating authority records for authors, they used to say gender was part of that. They no longer ask for you to identify gender as part of that, partly because it is good practice to, well, how do you know looking at a name what the gender of that name is?
Absolutely, yeah.
And partly because it proved a very big can of worms when they opened it and discovered just how many different ways you could possibly identify someone's gender.
Absolutely.
They decided that was best well alone. But of course, in an international context, there are many languages which are gendered and would like to know what the gender of the name is, so that when they have the description of that person's role with respect to the resource, saying that they are the illustrator or the author, there's a gendered term to be attached. So they need to know whether it's German for author or German for authoress. I don't know my languages very well, so German might not be the best example, but say Hebrew, I'm pretty sure is gendered. So there are questions I'm very pleased not to have to grapple with in the English language, let's put it that way.
Yes. No, that's great. Thanks very much. It was a rambling question and you've given a very good answer. I shall let someone else take part. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
We have a question from Sakina. What are your thoughts on metadata and ethics in cataloging?
Okay, partly related to Steve's query, and there are a few different sort of ethical hooks to address. One is, what do you do when you're cataloguing something which could be described as offensive by somebody else? The sort of famous example being Agatha Christie's novel, which is now generally known as And Then There Were None, but it started off being called 10 Little N-Words. And so that's not politically acceptable as a term, but there may be resources out there with that title on them. So if you were presented with that old novel and told catalogue it, you would have to transcribe the title as was given to follow the rules. But nowadays, it, as I say, is known as a different title. So you would also include that title for search purposes. If you're cataloguing a modern edition, which has the new politically acceptable title, And Then There Were None, you're quite happily providing that as the title. I don't think you're duty bound to say, and it used to be called anything else, because you can just deal with the resource as it's representing itself. So that's one aspect, cataloguing offensive material. I think if it presents itself as offensive, you have to record what's there. You can use explanatory notes to explain anything that you think needs explaining. But you don't need to seek out any offensiveness if it's not actually on the resource. Other ethical concerns sort of addressed by what Steve and I were just talking about with regards to out-of-date subject terminology, and not just out of date, also quite biased stuff exists in the subject headings particularly, because of course it was all done from a very white and middle-class centric perspective. We have to all acknowledge that we have biases just by our own existence. We don't necessarily even know what they are until they get drawn to our attention. So it's as well to have as varied and diverse a group of people devising standards as is possible to try and make sure that such biases don't creep in. There's lots of interesting work happening with the International Committee on the Cataloguing Ethics that's recently drafted a code of conduct, and the internet providing us with a more international viewpoint on stuff, so it's quite easy to attend or listen in on international conferences, and people share presentations on YouTube and so on. There was a New Zealand person recently shared something interesting about trying to iron out issues within the New Zealand national catalogue. So yeah, there's lots of good work happening on that sort of front, but never quickly enough. If you're somebody who's exercised by a particular name heading, it can't get changed quickly enough. Other aspects of ethics, I suppose. There's the something might be deemed offensive because of terminology used. Other stuff could just be deemed downright dangerous to exist at all, and that one is a tricky one. If it's a resource that you really wish didn't exist, do you really want to make sure users have access to it? I'm not sure. That's hopefully not an issue at whichever institution you work at. I suppose if you work at a national institution like the British Library, which is duty bound to catalogue all published output in the British Isles, that's when it gets more challenging, because you can't just say, we don't want this on our shelf. Fortunately, I don't have to deal with that. BDS doesn't have any shelves. we just deal with the data. Does that answer on ethics sufficiently?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.
Yes.
You're welcome. Are there any particular standards or aspects of metadata you'd like me to go into any more detail about? Any acronyms you want busted?
Right in.
Hey, Ralph, did you have something to say?
Oh, I'm sorry. I've just our connection has gone down. I've just logged in via my phone rather than. I'm sorry, so I haven't muted again. Apologies.
No, that's fine. I didn't have necessarily a question on the standards. It was just something that went back to the linked data. And this is probably just, my own ignorance on the system. But so, I mean, obviously librarians are using MARC still. And, go through the training to learn MARC, or at least read on how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
If you linked data is more useful, at least for certain libraries, is this something that they have to learn new code for, or anything like that?
It kind of depends at what level you're dealing with it. If in the future metadata specialists in libraries are creating and editing data that will be used in a linked data sense, and it's not just MARC records. I'm sure that there will be user interfaces that go along with that. So you'll basically have labeled fields that will ask you for certain data points. And then the stuff in the background will deal with the production of RDF triples that can then be published and exchanged. However, you're a systems librarian trying to wrangle such data and manage it, then you may need to know a bit more coding, and some basic HTML and XML sort of stuff will take you a reasonable distance to interrogation. It's not meant to be machine readable. As I say, an awful lot of the things at either end of the relationships will just be gobbledygook, because it'll be a URL that'll take you to a particular place in the web and the relationship in between. So you could have something like an author's ISNI identifier, and that would connect via friend of a friend to some other person identifier in Wikidata, say, that has associations with that author. So it's down to the user interfaces, I think, on that one. I can't see it ever being helpful for a cataloger who just needs to. There's lots of authority control work, so you need to be good at identifying the right person or the right organisation that you want to identify. Normal sort of authority control sort of interrogation rules apply there. You're looking for birth dates or some other disambiguation to make sure you've got the right person. And then you'd be using a controlled thesaurus of relationships that would say what relationship this person that you've identified has, whether it's to the resource that you're cataloguing or to some other entity out there on the web. So again, I think that's one of the things that's making it difficult to come up with the replacement for MARC, is that it's really difficult to conceptualize exactly how entity-based cataloging would work.
Yeah.
You need to sort of pull this entity out of thin air and then this other entity out of thin air and make a connection between them. And I think that is what's going to happen eventually, but it's a long way away. But
so I wonder, with coding, if there's always, librarians talking about, or, I go to certain computing sort of seminars, and they're, like how to, get, I guess, more librarians into coding. That might be one way.
Yeah, and there are lots of interesting projects out there. If you're interested in entity-based cataloging, then the Fritz's RDA in many metadata formats is a really useful training tool. RIMMF. If you just Google RIMF, RIMMF, then they have free software that you can download, and it really gets you into thinking about works, expressions, and manifestations. The problem with a MARC record is that it's so efficient, it kind of hides what you're doing from yourself. So in RDA, you're talking about identifying the work, identifying the expression, and describing the manifestation. And you can do all of those things straightforwardly in MARC, it's not a problem, but it hides what you're doing from yourself. If you've got a separate work title from manifestation title, great, you get a 240 or a 130 field and a 245 field. But if they're the same, MARC's efficiencies means that those collapse down, so you don't recognise that it's a work title and a manifestation title proper, because it's just a single 245 field. Whereas RIMF really pulls it all out, and you get to see all of these different data points properly dealt with in terms of work, expression, and manifestation. So it's a really useful training tool if you're trying to get your head around the entity side of things.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you. I'll have a look at that.
You're welcome.
Well, we've got a bit of a queue, so I'll ask Susie's question and then we can go to Steve.
Sure.
So Susie asks, so I'm trying to get my head around the coverage label in Dublin Core. Have you any thoughts? Most examples I have are relating to the place as subject and not the publication place. So how do the rest of you handle it?
Well, that would be a question for the rest of you, because I don't deal with Dublin Core, because repositories don't enter into my sphere. But I would have. It might be one that it's down to institutional policy as to what geographic import things have for your institution. Is it important to you where they came from, or is it important to you what they're about? But as I say, I'm not a Dublin Core user, so I'm afraid I'm not able to answer that one.
It's always a problem with students, because when they're looking at bib records and they see that there's a facet that says geography, they then want, that's great, that will tell me all of the records that have been published in the UK, because they're only interested in UK research. And then, of course, they find that it pulls out all of the records that are about the UK rather than published in the UK. So they do get a bit miffed at that. And you do need to find ways around to actually try and identify the material that they're looking for, sort of over and above what's actually in the metadata of the record itself.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it can be quite difficult.
Yeah, and Susie says they're just beginning to ask that question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big question that I've been sort of dealing with for many years. And it is because they see that. And I think the people that use the catalogues put their own meaning on the facets that they see, rather than actually understanding that that has a very specific meaning within the bibliographic data, which is unfortunate, but it's just something that we need to deal with, I think.
Did you have something else you wanted to ask, Steve?
Yes, sadly. Jenny was talking and mentioned in the discussion on linked data and MARC that linked data isn't meant to be machine readable.
It's not meant to be human readable. Sorry, if I'm.
Okay.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Because that I found confusing, because I wondered then where it would surface.
No, my apologies if I misspoke. Linked data is very much just machine readable. It is not meant to be human readable, which is, I think, where we find it difficult to conceptualize what user interfaces are going to be able to do for us, because it is just this big. I mean, my at least a decade ago, my technical director described it as, do you mean we're not just going to have neat bibliographic records anymore? It's just going to be triple soup. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
And of course, you get millions of them. You know, a few thousand bibliographic records. There's millions of data triples.
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
It's a real issue.
Goodness. I was going to ask about the, since I don't know much about the standards at all, you're using the Library of Congress standards?
We use Library of Congress for subject headings.
Oh, okay.
Because it's the most sort of internationally recognized subject thesaurus. We are expecting to move to use FAST in the future, which is a sort of linked data version of Library of Congress subject headings. But we haven't made the switch yet, not least because we really want to make the switch rather than have to do both. if we're assigning FAST, we don't want to be assigning LCSH as well. So that's a bit of an issue for us in terms of policy. Usually when a new standard comes along and we adopt it, we end up still having to support the old because our customers don't all move, and that can get quite complicated. So we've sort of been just keeping a watching eye on FAST at the moment. But the
FAST has gotten better because
Yeah.
I used it years ago and it was pretty limited.
yeah, it has got better and it's better supported. That was my initial concern when the British Library sought people's views a few years ago. My main concern was its maintenance and the fact that it was definitely going to stay because it was just an OCLC sort of project.
Yeah.
And they could have pulled the plug on it. And also, if it's based on LCSH, how does that work in the future if LCSH is, if everybody's using FAST and not LCSH, how would LCSH keep going? So there were a few sort of issues like that for me, but in terms of the actual headings themselves, I think it's very effective. And the old arguments about having much more specificity with Library of Congress subject headings are kind of mute because nobody's really searching them that way.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got something which is about 18th century poets in Paris and 19th century playwrights in London, you can have two specific LCSH that cover those things. But FAST headings would just be 19th century, 18th century, London, Paris, poets, playwrights, and you wouldn't have the specificity that meant it was 18th century poets in Paris and 19th century playwrights in London. FAST would lose that detail. LCSH would keep it.
Yeah.
But how important is that really when it comes to the people's search strategies? I think most people aren't searching in a way that means it matters enough.
Yeah, probably not.
But other subject things that we use are beyond subject headings. We're doing both Dewey classification and Library of Congress classification, because whilst public libraries are all Dewey, there's a broad use of Library of Congress classification in other sectors.
I think that's what they often use in the NHS. You can, I may be wrong, Steve, but I thought it was Library of Congress in the NHS. Is that
you're
the
completely right.
Yeah.
And the National Library of Medicine.
Yeah, we use a bastardized adaptation of Library of Congress.
Yeah.
Lots of places do.
As everywhere does, absolutely. It's like you see some very strange versions of DDC sometimes. And it's like, but we use DDC, but we've adapted it for our user group.
Yeah.
There's a huge sighs when people say that. But no, we use Library of Congress for my NHS library.
Right. Yeah. And we also work with the UK Library, UK SLC, UK subject library categories. So it's a sort of broad brush approach to subject stuff that gives sort of broad categories, which can be used by libraries for shelving purposes. So fiction genres and broad subject categories like lifestyle or advice and rights or history or military, that kind of thing. But we tend to just do mappings to achieve that. There's quite a lot can be accomplished with mappings.
Do you ever have difficulties with international metadata? Is that something that standards pretty clear across most places?
Yeah, I would have to say if within the standard we don't have much difficulty. We there are some policy differences, but not really significant ones. So looking at data, as long as it's in Mark 21, there's not really much difference. Unimark is quite a different flavour of mark, so we supply Unimark, but my familiarity with that format is not very alive in my mind. I had to work out the translation between the two, but once I'd done that, I didn't keep having to look at it, so I haven't refreshed. I've still got a good working knowledge of UK Mark because I used it for long enough before we switched to Mark 21 that I can still remember. And we still supply UK Mark because there are still libraries that have not switched, mostly due to not having upgraded their library management systems. I'm sure there's still a few people hanging on to it because it's better and I'm not letting it go. But that argument sailed a long time ago, unfortunately.
Yeah, I imagine so. Holding on to those old systems can cause all kinds of problems anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a dead format. It hasn't been maintained for, was it 2006? The British Library stopped maintaining UK Mark, so it's long since gone.
Yes.
But it was more specific, which is why people liked it.
Yeah, I can see the appeal in that. Well, I guess this might be more of a long-term kind of thing, getting people to think about that. But I guess if you were going to advise someone to go into metadata, if someone was interested in doing it, what kind of advice would you give them as far as how things are changing and how they might make their sort of work future-proof if possible?
Yeah. Well, as a group of professionals, I would say we're not brilliant at advocating for ourselves, but hopefully anybody who does come across library metadata can see the ways in which it can fail them or make their life much easier by being fit for purpose. As far as I'm concerned, metadata is the beating heart of any library service. You might not know how the pump works, and you might need to call in an expert to fix it if it's not working properly. But if it's not working properly, then the rest of the organisation just is going to fail in its endeavours. So what's important as a metadata specialist? I think it's akin to puzzle solving all day long. So if you enjoy solving puzzles and having a satisfaction in a quiet job well done, then it's a good sphere to be in. It does require attention to detail and an ability to be methodical, because when you're working your way through creating or editing metadata, there is quite a lot of finicky detail involved. In terms of the future, it's the authority control work that's going to be the more important thing. Entity cataloguing, if we do move past Mark, it's going to be about identifying entities, which is effectively authority control work. You're recording the important identifying features of something. So the identifying important features of Jane Eyre is that it is known as Jane Eyre and it was written by. And then you've got the authority entity to sort out for the author. So you're going to take care of each of the Bronte sisters, and you can make relationships between each of them and their created works, their entities, and hanging off each of those, you've got the much less important stuff, which is which ISBN record belongs with that. It's all about the authority control when it comes to entity cataloguing. And those bits of work, the creating of those entities are fundamental and vital. So Wikidata and wiki type work is sort of useful experience in that, when you're establishing facts and making connections between things. That's quite relevant. And in terms of the here and now and how to expand, I would say there is a lot of freely available training resources online if you want to chase them down. And I'm really happy if anybody wants to get in touch to ask about specific things. I'll direct them to resources I think are useful. But in terms of entity cataloging, I think probably the RIMF tool that I mentioned a few minutes ago is a good place to start in terms of getting to grip with life post Mark, if you want to do that. And there's some in fact, I think the slides I showed to try and illustrate some linked data were pulled from RIMF. So those were RIMF data sets that I was showing on Sign. And I think it was Jane Eyre, in fact, that was being shown.
Oh my gosh.
That's probably why my brain picked up on that classic work that I want to talk about.
I can't say that I saw Jane Eyre immediately in that.
Oh no, I'm wrong. It was Emma and Jane Austen that was being talked about. They had a Jane-a-thon, which generated a bunch of data.
Oh my gosh. Oh. Yeah, Susie says, I think you should probably put that on a t-shirt. Metadata is the beating heart of the library service.
I'm sure other people have said it. It's true, whatever query is coming to a librarian, they're going to need to interrogate their library management system, and it's the metadata that is key to that working. If somebody comes to you and says, I need Hamlet, okay, great, and then they say in Polish, how are you going to find that except by having good metadata that tells you what the language of your resource is? And maybe they don't need it in Polish, but they need it to be an audio version because they're dyslexic. So again, your metadata will tell you that its content type is audio rather than text. So those details become really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that, the more sophisticated your users get as well,
Yes.
The more they're going to be looking for certain things.
Yeah, and of course, if they, you give them one successful outcome, they then expect more and more. So
yes, indeed. So Kana asks, am I right in thinking that metadata does rely on knowledge and experience of the cataloger?
To an extent, there are tools that one looks up. I don't have the whole of the Library of Congress of Classification in my head. It's an entire trolley's worth of volumes. Pretty good on my Dewey because it's a smaller data set to remember, but it speeds you up. If you have greater depth of knowledge and experience, then it speeds up how quickly you can produce the sort of finished result of a bibliographic record. But the principal knowledge and experience that you have in order to be able to do it is to know where to find the answer. So how to, which standard you're applying and how to interrogate that to help you get guided to producing the correct data. I think probably in terms of knowledge and experience, it's the subject analysis and access is where that really counts. You certainly need training to be able to do any of the tasks involved, but the descriptive metadata, it's more about a general understanding of the principles, and there's less sort of in-depth knowledge and experience. But certainly if you're doing a big number build in Dewey, it can get pretty complex, and a bit of knowledge behind you certainly helps. But yeah, in terms of the day-to-day, it's difficult. You know, I've been doing it for a long time now, so it's difficult to know which bits I'm doing through knowledge and experience and which bits I'm doing by looking answers up. But it's not something that you can do without having your reference tools to hand. You're always having to look up things. The knowledge and experience and helps, but also the knowledge and experience to know where to find the answer helps. It's not that you necessarily have all the answers in your own head. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, Steve has written in here, does BDS own the IP in the metadata that you provide?
Yeah, to an extent. Licensing issues are something that's discussed every now and then, because we supply data to customers, and that's fine. But then some of our customers are library suppliers who are then going to go and give that data to somebody else. And some of our customers could be part of a union catalogue. So if they then put that data into their catalogue, it's automatically being given to anybody else who's using that catalogue. So there are licensing issues every now and then. The business model, when BDS started in 1995, the net book agreement was still in place, and you couldn't compete on the price of a book being sold to a library. So library suppliers were competing purely on the services that went along with the books that they supplied. And bibliographic data was one of those services. And every single library supplier up and down the land had a bib department, and they were all doing the same very costly exercise to supply data. So my boss, Leslie White, had the idea of having a standalone company that would do this task for library suppliers and make it more cost effective for them all if they outsourced their bibliographic data requirements to BDS. And that worked, and that was great. And we had lots of library suppliers as customers and no libraries. And then the net book agreement failed. And so libraries could pick and choose on the cost of the book they were purchasing, and then organise getting their data separately. So we started to supply direct to libraries. So the business model is always moving, and each time it moves, we have to come up with new ways, because obviously it's very expensive to create a top quality record that has all of the authority control built in, has several different subject schemas being used. I mean, it's thousands and thousands of pounds just to subscribe to Dewey annually for us, because we have such a heavy use of it. And nobody wants to pay more than they have to for their data. So our business model is built on the basis of, create the best quality record that will work for everybody, and then sell it as many times as possible, so that the people we're selling it to can afford the small bit cost, but overall we still get to enough money to pay for what we're doing. So if we were to sell it to one person only, and it was to then go into a space where everybody could access it for free, that would burst our business model. So there are, as always, licensing stuff. So yes, there are contracts signing to say that you won't then give it away to somebody else, that kind of thing. And of course, different contracts have to be devised for different library situations. But we're selling data. We're selling data to publishers. We're selling data to libraries. We're selling data to system suppliers. We're selling data to library book suppliers. So
Sorry, that's Pog.
I've obviously said enough on the.
It's like, that's a lot of data.
Yep, it is.
Oh, goodness. Was there anything else you wanted to share, Jenny? I know that some people have had to run off, so we could wrap up here if you want to. That looks like got Jenny frozen a little bit.
Yeah, she's frozen my end as well.
Yeah, no. Well, let's see. There's not much you can do, I guess. Let's